Welcome to our coffee chat on transit fleet electrification with a special guest, Zach Agish from RIPTA. I am going to just do a brief intro and then we'll have folks introduce themselves and then we'll get right into it. So Stella, if we could go to the third slide, please, the guidelines slide. So you probably noticed you've all joined the meeting with muted microphones. If you could all rename yourselves in Zoom to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. To participate in the discussion, you'll be able to select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up the raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar, and then we'll call on you. If you're on the phone, I don't think we have anybody on the phone, but if you are, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Stella, Jordan via the chat box, sjordan@ctps.org, or 857-702-3675. Next slide, please. This meeting is accessible to folks with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. Again, if you require any additional accommodations in order to participate, please contact Stella Jordan of the MPO staff at sjordan@ctps.org or 857-702-3675. Next slide, please. So just in the interest of time, normally we go and do a verbal go around for folks to introduce themselves, but we do have a presentation today and leaving time for discussion. I'm going to say, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Give us your name, your affiliation, and your location or transit service area or who you work for and what transit provider you represent. And I think we'll just have folks tell us who they are that way. Next slide, please. And just a brief overview of today's meeting. We're going to do the welcome, which we're doing now. Zach is going to talk to us a little bit about RIPTA's electrification program, where then there's going to be a discussion with some prompt questions, and then do a brief closing and next steps, including talking a little bit about upcoming events. So with that, I think we will throw it over to Zach to talk a little bit about RIPTA's zero emissions vehicle fleet strategy.
Thank you, Sandy. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you this afternoon about what we're doing down here in Rhode Island about fleet electrification. So this, just to give you a little bit of a background as to who I am RIPTA's principal planner for capital development. So I am one of the primary people responsible for implementing our zero emissions vehicle pilot program, or probably less so a pilot now, and we're getting closer to a much larger discussion on full transition, but also a range of other capital projects, including long-range strategic planning, including our transit master plan implementation. So that's just a very basic overview, and I'm happy to give more background to me as we get to the end. But let's just dive right on in. Stella, next slide, please. So how I've broken this presentation into primarily three major areas, one of which we'll start with kind of just giving you guys a background as to where we are currently with our electrification efforts. We'll go through some of the lessons we've learned so far with our pilot program to date, and just some of the things for us to all keep in mind in the transportation sphere as we're all talking about this very, very complicated and very expansive topic area. And then kind of give you a preview as to what we're about to undertake down here in Rhode Island in terms of strategic planning around electrification. So with that, can we go to the next slide? So when we first started our electric bus pilot program, it was largely kind of just like, all right, we have a vehicle, we have a charger, let's just put it on the road and see what happens. And we pretty quickly did that, and we realized that's probably not the best way to plan for this, given that transit routes and transit service areas are vastly different from route to route and location to location. So we decided that we would just figure out how that panned out and ultimately figure out what is the actual limitations with the vehicle we had. Then we decided, okay, now that we've done some initial route testing and just kind of put our electric bus throughout the network, what would be our actual first true adoption of this particular vehicle type. And now we've been having some conversations, and I'll get into this a little bit more throughout the presentation, kind of where we go in terms of a sustainable and resilient deployment over the long term. Next slide. So the first phase involves us as an agency leasing electric buses, 3 of them in particular from Proterra. And it took us a little while to get them on. There was some operational reviews and some vehicle compliance things we had to get because we had procured these vehicles from another agency. But they were built with 440 kilowatt hour batteries. They're being primarily depot charged here in our facility here at Elmwood. And we largely realized that that it was important to make known to our stakeholders that even though we had these 3 particular buses on the road, their performance would be different than any other vehicle we would ultimately be procuring down the road. Next slide. And so some of the testing we did with these Proterras, and it's become something far more noticeable as we've been going through the last year or so, is that as I mentioned on phase 2, we said, okay, we put them on a number of routes, but we need to kind of hone in and narrow down what we wanted to do. And so we decided we would ultimately electrify our most contained route, which is also our busiest and our most frequent route, the R line, which runs from downtown Pawtucket to South Providence and the Kansas City line. But those blocks were written to be hundreds of miles per day. As you can see on the right, prior to us making this decision, we'd have blocks that would run anywhere from 103 miles to 136 miles a day. But we were finding with these electric buses that we had on the road, they were largely only succeeding in about 70 miles or so. And so that meant, okay, in order for us to put these vehicles on acceptably, we have to cut those blocks in half, which for many service planners and planners in general, this does present some operational risk, because now you are adding some inefficiency to your service and probably adding to operational costs by now having to have multiple vehicles doing the same level of work that you would have needed one vehicle to do. So that is something that we're definitely keeping an eye on and looking into. But also, as we made this transition to our busiest and most frequent route, it allowed us to have a much better sense of the energy consumption levels that we were witnessing on the vehicles, and allowed us to also get a much better sense of the vehicle modeling, as opposed to just throwing the vehicles across the whole network. And that way we could start building a trend line to have a better sense of what we could potentially experience with an ultimate deployment. Next slide. So having had these Proterras on the road, probably now, let's see, we had them on 2019, 2020, 2021. So they've been on the road for about 2.5 years or so. And so towards the latter half of last year, we made an agency decision to electrify the R line for real. And so we made the procurement decision to acquire 14 40-foot New Flyer Excelsior buses. We're getting them off of Connecticut's standing order. And we are having the first one be fabricated right now. We're supposed to get images of the completed vehicle in a couple weeks' time, with the remainder being prepared for final delivery this fall. But one of the things that we're working on here in my department is making sure the alignment of that vehicle procurement aligns with the infrastructure installation, because it would be one thing to have very nice buses, but then realize, well, they're electric, so if we don't have a charging source, they have buses just sitting in a yard, which is of no use to anybody. So we're coordinating our schedules on both sides to make sure that we're not having a gap between them. But one of the exciting things as part of this is that because these vehicles will be running exclusively on this particular route, it means that 1 in every 5 of our passengers will actually be on an electric bus, which is pretty astonishing, given our ridership and given that we are a statewide transit operator. So we're definitely looking forward to seeing the reactions from folks there. But as we were doing the development for this particular expansion effort, we identified pretty quickly that doing depot only charging was not going to be an efficient operation for us. And so we made the strategic decision and probably the slightly more expensive option to actually install a number of on-route chargers that will be installed this spring down at a property we own at the city line between Providence and Cranston that will enable us to charge those vehicles every trip or every other trip. We're still doing some modeling, but we think we can get away with every other trip. But this also means that now that we're having this experience, it allows us to start thinking through what the next steps are in the future. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of what that next step is. So the R line is a contained route. And so now we're saying, okay, because we're a statewide operator, we can't just go from one route to the whole system. So what's the next major step we will take? Let's say, all right, let's concentrate on electrifying an entire facility and all the services that are based out of that facility. And so we're currently still scoping this out. This is still kind of in process, but hopefully we'll have some more details in the coming months. It would involve procuring up to 40 electric buses that would operate on 6 routes based out of our Newport garage. It would involve facility improvements and charging infrastructure at the Gateway Center, which is our primary hub for Southern Rhode Island, and at our garage in the neighboring town of Middletown. And as another component, one of which our state's Office of Energy Resources is very interested in, is the development and the installation of a resiliency demonstration, which could be a microgrid, it could be battery storage, it could be a combination of other renewable energy sources. And we're still trying to figure out what would make sense there, but that is a component. And so some of the funding that has been identified for this project, and this is not going to be a cheap project by any means. I mean, I think our estimate was close to $50 million if you include vehicles, would be FTA's low emissions program. You have the state giving a contribution, Office of Energy Resources, our own capital budget, and then Senator Reed has also written in an earmark, which is yet to be approved in the THUD appropriations bill to help support the project too. So there'll be a lot more news and information that I can definitely share with this group as this project evolves. Next slide. So that being said, while we are moving forward with electrification, it's important for us to also, being an operator with a number of vehicles, to also kind of convey to those interested what we've learned and what we are still kind of exploring as we're going through this process, and keeping in mind, because as we all know, this is a rapidly evolving area, and we're always learning something new. But next slide. But it's important to kind of stress that it's really a spectrum of things. It's not just one particular element, but it encompasses anything from energy costs and vehicle costs to energy requirements. Obviously, range is a big topic when it comes to service planning, the effects on the weather and the temperature, the resiliency, just general operations day to day, and then just the level of technology that is actually involved in electric vehicle deployment that goes beyond just saying, hey, I have a diesel bus, all right, put it on the road for 8 hours, we'll come, great. So I want to just kind of give you a highlight across each of these topics, just so you have some things to keep in mind as you're having conversations amongst yourselves, or if you have questions that I can probably elucidate further when I'm finished with the presentation. Next slide. So one of the first things, and this is definitely something that transit agencies, especially in the capital budgeting and capital planning world, definitely keep in mind, is vehicle price and the kind of the scalability of a vehicle. And unlike a lot of purchases where you get the price up front, that's not always the case when you're buying a bus. And so we've been doing a lot of research with a number of our peers nationwide, and also talking with other agencies that have done pilots to kind of get a sense of where their cost is. And they have found, on average, and we have kind of also confirmed this with some of our own work, that a standard diesel bus for RIPTA is about $650,000. An electric bus is about $1 million. So we're talking close to a 40% increase. And when you think about that cost, then you say, okay, I have one standard diesel bus that runs on a block that could last anywhere from 12 to 16 hours. But if your electric bus maybe only be doing 8 hours and you don't want to change your service levels, then you're looking at potentially needing two vehicles for every one. And so now your cost balloons. let alone not just your capital cost, but also your operational costs, because now you need 2 operators to run the same level of service. So that is something that we're definitely keeping a very close eye on. We'll be doing a lot more modeling once we get far more into the weeds of our process. I'm keeping an eye on the chat for questions, and Joe, I'll definitely answer your question towards the end because it will elucidate what we're up to. So I have seen it. Next slide. Another thing, which I think kind of eludes a lot of people outside of the transit world, in the transportation sector particularly, is that it is one thing to buy a vehicle and it's another to put it on the road. But because it's electric, we also have to talk about the fact that it costs energy. And when you have a diesel bus, you're just strictly talking about what is the price of diesel fuel, and can you lock yourself in, or are you in an area which you feel comfortable given the fluctuations. In this case for us, and I can't speak to other transit agencies, but I can just speak for myself. You know, RIPTA is a fully fledged commercial utility ratepayer. We don't have a special rate. We do not have a special discount for this. So once we put these 14 electric buses on the road, we're estimating that we're going to be seeing our energy usage increase by 1/3, which for an agency of our size is not a small amount. And just by deduction, if you were to transition the whole fleet, you know, you're talking many times over. And so we've been talking with National Grid, our utility, which will soon be PPL, to secure a short-term discount on demand charges, which in some cases could be upwards of 70% of our monthly bill, to make the transition as easy as possible, at least in the short term, while we try and figure out the long-term cost. And so we've been talking with our stakeholders down here by saying, okay, if you want us to make this transition, we're going to see an increase in electricity usage. It means we're going to have an increase in electricity costs, which ultimately means that our operating expenses as an agency are going to go up, and that needs to be reflected across the whole agency, not just for the vehicle specifically, but in terms of our facilities and so forth. Next slide. Just to speak about the energy requirements for a moment, I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that electric buses are very energy intensive. Until we actually have the vehicles in the road, it will be really hard for us to identify exactly how much energy we would be consuming. But based on the early modeling of the electric buses that we're ordering against the blocks that we would be assigning them to, we've come to the estimation that we'd be consuming about 1.2 megawatts a day, which is a very large increase from what we're currently using as an agency, just generally speaking. The equivalence of that is nearly 1,000 homes. So if 14 equals about 1,000, imagine a fleet of 200 to 400 electric buses. That's a lot of power that has to be found, a lot of power that needs to be distributed, and ultimately needs to be available on a regular basis. And so we're still engaging with the utilities to have a better sense of what is the near-term possibilities for transition, and then ultimately what are the investments that need to be made as a community, as a state as a whole, to actually realize this. Because at the same time, not only are we trying to find power for our buses, but there's also the conversation of those who want to electrify personal vehicles. So now if you add that into the mix, it's a much larger conversation, and it's only just started. Not only here, I imagine it's only started up in Massachusetts as well. So that's something we should all be keeping in mind. Next slide. Another thing, and we'll spend only a second on this, I've had many stakeholders tell me, oh, you have a charger, you can put a bus, it's going to be fine. The charger you see on the right is not the same type of infrastructure that I need. The charger on the left is a much lower degree of power, typically around 35 to 50 kilowatts. When in my case for an electric bus, especially when you have service that has to run constantly, you may need upwards of 350 to 400 kilowatts per charge. And in the transit world, that charge needs to happen rather quickly. So you will start to see a lot more conversation around high energy voltage related chargers, which are very expensive, very energy intensive, and are not easy to site. So I emphasize, if you haven't started having that conversation now with your utility or your municipalities, now's the time to start, because it's not a simple process. Next slide. So generally in the fleet electrification conversation, there are pretty much three charging solutions, and I want to recognize that they're rapidly evolving. So a depot charger today is going to be far more efficient 3 years from now. So depot chargers are typically slow chargers. You typically plug them into the side of the battery, the side of the bus, just like kind of, I guess, unfortunate way to describe it is if you're connecting your diesel powered vehicle to a fuel pump. There's fast charging, which is typically pantograph based. That's typically the model that we're headed. And then there's another fast charging solution, which is wireless or induction, which is still rather new. There are not many transit agencies I've spoken to that have gone this direction. But again, it depends on the climate. I mean, we're all up here in New England. Wireless may not be as efficient in the winter, but if you're in, say, Florida or California, it's probably far more prevalent because you don't have snow. So just keep that in mind if you do consider that. I don't have enough data to support whether that's the right move for all of us as agencies up here to do that, but it is an option. Next slide. But I think one of the biggest things we as transit operators are ultimately responsible for, obviously, is our first mandate is to provide service and make sure that service is available as often as we can provide it. And so we, like any other transit operator, will constantly be marketed by the OMBs to say, oh, our vehicles can go 200, 250, 300 miles in a day. But they don't typically state that those mileage rates are under ideal conditions. And so when someone says, oh, that bus can last all day, you're going to see a major divergence between what the ideal is and what you're actually going to operate. And Proterra, I say this as a collective group of friendly people, I have not seen exactly what the manufacturers told me that I was expecting. They would say, oh, you could last 150, 200 miles. Well, I haven't exactly seen that. I've seen it maybe go about 140 on average, which is a bit of a concern for me because 50% of all of my statewide services are above 140 miles a day. So that now means if I were to transition everything as it stood today with no service changes, no frequency changes, I can only provide half of my service. But that doesn't even account for any of the vehicle conditions that come with, do I need 2 for 1 for all these blocks? That's something we're still looking into. And when we've talked with our peers, I do want to emphasize that RIF to service profile is much different than most because we're a statewide operator, we have higher than average service blocks. But we do emphasize that at the end of the day, while batteries will improve and charging systems will improve, the charging strategy is really the key to offset the range limitations, at least in the near term. Now, if someone were to develop a battery that said, oh, you can actually last 300 miles in cold weather, that would be a game changer. But that is some time away. So that is something that we're definitely keeping in mind as we're building out our long-term process. Next slide. Thank you. As I mentioned before, we are in New England. It's cold. We have snow. Well, some of us have snow. There's not as much snow outside my window right now. But we've definitely seen that when the temperature either has been below 40 or above 90, we've seen our effective range of our battery buses decline by 30%, which is a big deal, right? If you have a bus out for 8 hours and you lost 30% of your charge, you may not make it through the whole 8 hours that you have the bus on the road. This research was found by the Zero Emissions Bus Resource Alliance. We've had the same exact experience. And again, a lot of it is influenced by the weather. So if it's really hot, you're going to be using AC units far more often. If it's cold, you're going to be using the heating more often. And we've seen this with our energy consumption, where on a day which is like in the teens, I'd have the per mileage, a kilowatt hour consumption well over 4, which means you're burning through your state of charge much faster than you would on a day when it was 60 out. One thing that has also been emphasized to us, and I can't speak for every agency, but many of us which have diesel buses, some of us preheat our buses using a preheater, typically diesel powered. And this is mainly to prevent our batteries from going cold at the start of the day. And if we didn't do that, we would have shorter durations of service. And there are some who have said, well, could you get an electric preheater? And we've said, well, we could do that, but it will consume power from the battery that we need to power the bus. So you may also be making that situation worse. But it's my understanding from conversations with peers that generally there is advancements in this field, but it's just still really new. And a lot of agencies that I've spoken to have said, all right, we're still going to buy the diesel heater, but we will use our own funds so states don't get themselves in trouble when they say their vehicles are not 100% zero emissions free. So I would say you're getting a nearly zero emissions free vehicle, at least for the time being. And with these hot and cold days, I have seen our electricity costs be higher because I can get data on a day-to-day basis. And that is something I'm definitely keeping in mind as we're doing our transition. Next slide. Then one cannot go without talking about transition without talking about resiliency, redundancy, and probably in the better sense, the effects that we're all experiencing with climate change. If we're all going to make these fleet transition over the long term, and particularly here in Rhode Island, it's far more noticeable. We have to plan for continuity of service. With a diesel bus, all you have to do is call your fuel provider and say, hey, I need more fuel, or you store a lot more fuel in your tank on property. But electricity, if you're down on the grid, you know, down for 10 minutes, that's one thing. But if you're down for 24 hours, if you're down for several days, that throws an entirely different picture. And so we've been talking with RIDOT and with municipalities and with the utility with aligning infrastructure projects and electrical infrastructure programs to align with this in mind. And we are recognizing that areas that we need to explore include renewable energy solutions, battery storage, microgrids. And we do think that our Newport project that I alluded to earlier in the presentation really gives us this first opportunity to really get a sense of what is the true scale and what is the true cost of making this transition. Microgrids and battery storage are still fairly new when it comes to transportation. And so we need to have a much better sense of what that looks like and what the costs are. So the demonstration should give us a sense of scale, because that is something we're going to have to build into a lot of our facility projects and our vehicle expansion programs for the future. Next slide. And then transition-wise, there's just the general impacts of transportation operations on a day-to-day basis. There's driver training changes that have to be made in terms of vehicle usage of regenerative braking and acceleration, training them to how to use the charging infrastructure as opposed to just saying, please park the bus at the back of the yards, the utility will charge it. The maintenance staff needs to be trained, and there are certain processes they have to be prepared for. There's a whole new conversation around how you store vehicles and how you stage those vehicles. There's the impacts again on, well, if you have a zero emissions fleet, how does it change your scheduling and the vehicle requirements for that service? And then at the very beginning, when you're procuring a vehicle, it's a whole different conversation around how you get it. A lot of us in the transit world will say, all right, we have a bus order for 5 years. We've said we want a certain number of vehicles. We tell Gillig or New Flyer or Nova Bus or whatever you have and say, I need 10 buses this year. Well, with an electric bus, maybe that might not be the right procurement strategy anymore. Maybe you get to I bought the vehicle, but I'm leasing the battery, or it's maybe I'm leasing the bus outright. And so that's still a conversation I think we're all still trying to sort through is, you know, this is a new world in terms of what is the most financially prudent strategy. I clearly don't have the answer to that right now. But then there's also the contracts around how do you hold the bus manufacturer accountable for that vehicle? Do you make it performance-based? Do you set certain targets or milestones? It's still an ongoing conversation. Next slide. And then the last thing I want to mention, just in terms of what we've learned and something for all of us to kind of keep in mind as we're having this conversation, is that there's a lot more technology and a lot more technology literacy that's required to better understand this transition and managing it effectively. You know, some of the technology that I procured specifically during the pilot has been really seeing the vehicle performance in real time. I think that's really key as we not only see the effects of vehicles on the road, but it also allows us to better gauge where we expect to see the difficulties in the deployment and understanding kind of the limitations. But then on the energy side, it's good to know what your real-time charging infrastructure looks like. Are systems up and down? In terms of just managing the power flow, it's good to know how much you're expending and how much you're consuming. particularly as you help correlate that against your energy costs and infrastructure limitations and have a better conversation with the utility. And then ultimately from the service side, we need to still do a lot better work on modeling our services and optimizing our services for functionality and efficiency, because electric buses are going to add a whole new factor to how we plan out our service blocks and our schedules. And with that, I kind of just want to move into the last portion where I'm going to just kind of give you a sense of what we're doing as an agency going forward before we kind of go into discussion. Next slide, or next two slides rather. Next slide. There you go. So, nope. There you go. So there are four kind of big things that we're here at RIPTA we're kind of focused on in terms of the transition. So first off is integrating fleet electrification with our state's first ever transit master plan. And this kind of will speak to Joe's question in the chat, and I'll get into that in a second. We still need to continue strengthening our partnerships with our Department of Energy, Department of Environmental Management, the Office of Energy Resources, the utility, the municipalities, and with others, because at the end of the day, it really is a collective effort. It isn't just RIPTA, it isn't just the state. Everyone needs to be engaged in this process because it involves zoning regulations, it involves utility tariffs. It's a massive, complex conversation that needs to have everyone involved. And I would stress that to everyone in Massachusetts, that you need to be engaging with every stakeholder, whether they agree with this process or not, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to buy into it. Down here in Rhode Island, we do have a legislatively mandated act on climate, which gives specified targets for greenhouse gas reduction. So that is something where we're trying to figure out how our program aligns with those goals set by the General Assembly, with DEM being the lead on that. And then ultimately, as we all know by now, the federal government has dropped a large windfall of infrastructure money for transit through the IIJA. And so we're having a better understanding of how we can leverage those infrastructure investment opportunities, whether it's through the LONO program, the Bus and Bus Facilities program, other programs that may have come through, or if there are opportunities for partnership with other state agencies that might be getting related infrastructure funding from other elements of the bill. Next slide. So just to speak on the Transit Master Plan for a moment, this is the first time the state of Rhode Island has ever generated such a plan where we've already outlined and provided recommendations on how we want to see transit evolve over the next 20 years. It's a component of our long-range transportation plan, which was adopted back in December of 2020, which calls for the improvement of existing services, expanding service to new areas. Although Rhode Island, RIPTA does serve many parts of Rhode Island, there are many parts that still are underserved today. We've identified a need for high capacity transit, improving accessibility to transit, and to make service easier to use. Next slide. And so in that framework, as we're talking about fleet electrification, it's critical to realize, all right, if we're going to make this transition, we can't think about electrification today, but we have to think about it over the next 2 decades. And so as we're fleshing out this plan and implementing it, we're already saying, all right, if we have a target for 10-minute service on X route, how do we already start lining up that infrastructure? How do we start lining up that vehicle requirement so we can already start planning in advance, not the capital cost, but also the operational cost to do that? And so that's what we've been doing here in our department and with our colleagues in service planning, is to start tying those milestones against our initial projections. Next slide. And so to speak to Joe's question, if we are in the process of doing a zero emissions vehicle implementation, and we're doing the implementation of the Transit Master Plan, we actually have to develop an action plan to address both of those needs. And so we just recently ran a RFP. We got proposals back. We're still in the process of evaluating them to develop this action plan that would not only speak to the transition to a zero emissions fleet, and we've done some initial planning through a sustainable fleet transition plan, But that just sets the stage for this larger conversation, while also addressing all the other underlying transitions, including service growth in the future with the Transit Master Plan, workforce development requirements, facility expansions, and any of the infrastructure that goes with that, infrastructure that goes with electrification. And so it is going to be a very intense, probably 8 to 12 months here at RIPTA as we're in the process of doing that effort. And I'm more than happy to share with folks in this group as we reach major milestones to kind of share with you that process. I'm also happy to share the scope of work that we did put out to bid, and happy to speak more to that as well by email. But I think it's from my conversation with our peers, a lot of them are just starting this process, and I suspect some of them are writing really short-term plans to be accessible to Lono right now. And then I think a lot of them are going to go back to that plan and then write a much larger plan. But we can definitely talk about zero emission transition plans in a larger detail and discussion. But this is the thing that I will be focusing a lot of my time and energy on over the next year or so. And with that, that's what I have for everyone this afternoon.
Thank you, Zach. Quite an informative and thorough presentation. Stella, if you could jump forward 2 slides, please. And Zach, if you want to put your contact information in the chat so that folks know how to reach you, that would be great. So I want to, open it up, give people a chance to ask Zach questions, but I also have some discussion questions that are on the slide here on the screen. I'm also going to put in the chat that, just as suggestions for folks for other questions that you might want to be thinking about. I see Sarah Lee has some questions in the chat. Zach, if you want to respond to that. So 1, are you storing the vehicles outside? Has that been an issue? Personal EVs have limited maintenance needs. Are buses similar? And is there a cost savings on that side? And can you share driver feedback about the buses? So we can start with that, and other folks take a moment to formulate your questions, and then put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Yeah, no, so Sarah, I appreciate the questions. They're actually all very pertinent ones. So first, for the 3 electric buses that we have right now, they're all being stored indoors. We do have a facility on our property that is underutilized and does have a vehicle bay. And that's also where the chargers are. But that is something we do have to look at as we look at service growth and ultimately full electrification, is that we don't have the facility space to store every vehicle in our fleet indoors. And so that starts to raise a question of what is that threshold of saying, all right, what are the total number we can store indoors that are electric, given that space is going to change with the charging infrastructure being installed. And then ultimately, okay, if we can only store, let's say 80 indoors, do we now have to start building in capital funding and fundraising for a new facility to actually store the electric buses indoors? And has it been an issue? The times when they've been outside in the winter, which was probably the first winter we had, it became an issue where it was harder to charge the vehicles up in the morning because of the preheaters. But it is definitely something we're definitely looking into as we not only get our 14, and we've already designated space inside one of our buildings for those 14, so we always know they're going to be indoors. But we need to look at the long term. In terms of the maintenance needs, yes, there are going to be many things that are taken out. There are certain fluids that are not going to be required. There are certain heavy maintenance requirements that are not going to be as necessary. But I think one thing I should stress, and you put this in your question, is there a cost savings? Most transit agencies have not had their electric buses longer than 12 years. So no one's really been able to be in a position to say, oh, we've had an electric bus for 14 years. We got our full capital investment back, or we saved $20,000 in fuel, or what have you. And so there's very limited data to that effect. Is there a savings? There probably will be, but there's not enough data to back that up yet. And then, in terms of driver feedback, I think it's important to note that every driver has their own opinion. Some will really love them. Some will say, I'm never going to drive an electric bus, or I just won't choose a job that has one. I think it really varies. One thing that is important is that, while the training of a bus driver from diesel to electric may not be intense, it still requires some level of training. And some may say, I've been driving a diesel bus for 30 years. I'm not going to do that. But that does present an operational challenge for us where we say, well, we don't have a driver who's trained. It's unassigned on a block that is an electric bus. Whoops, well, I guess we're not putting that bus on the road today. And in this case, with the 14 we're ordering, that really isn't a condition we can be in because people are expecting these 14 to be on the R line. They're not expecting us to have, 12 electric buses and 1 diesel bus on the route. And so that is something we're trying to work through. And then it's going to be important for us as we do our transition over the long term. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, I can definitely answer more by email.
Thank you, Zach. Any other questions? Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
Hi. We're sort of early on in the process of thinking about this, but I was curious, since I work on the service planning side, I care a lot about things like if we need to change our assumptions about block lengths, and that's going to have a certain cost in programming all that in. But also at the point of the yard, did you end up getting any sort of like charge management system, or like what tool are you using to make sure that whatever run you're sending a bus out on, that there's enough juice to make it back?
So it's good to see you, Melissa, first off. And actually, Logan asked this question about charge management software. I just have to email him back, but I'll answer your question here and I'll make sure I follow up with him more specifically on the technology side. So for the 3 Proteras, when we originally got them, we were relying upon the bus manufacturer system, which you really do need to look at them very carefully. So what we did pretty early on was say, okay, we're going to purchase a third-party software. The one that we've been using for our pilot is called Veracity. They just recently got bought by ChargePoint. So I can see in real time the state of charge on that vehicle. So I can log in at 6 in the morning and I get my my daily shift report. So I know which blocks and which jobs those vehicles have been assigned to. I have those panels open on my multiple screens here at my desk, and I can see exactly over the entire day how that trend has gone down. I can see their consumption over time. I can see, I can get alerts saying, oh, the charge is below 30%. Oh, the charge is below 20%. Oh, you should probably take the bus off the road because it may not return. So I see that. But for the chargers themselves, I don't have a management software for that, but it is something that I am going to have to get and procure. And that is something that I'm exploring right now. And I have some initial research that I've done, particularly for the on-route chargers, because we're putting a lot of faith and trust that those on-route chargers are going to keep these 14 buses powered, throughout the entire service day. My model right now has shown that I can get away with 2 round trips before I have to charge them. But we could find out that that's entirely wrong, and we could find out we have to charge them every trip, in which case that changes the entire profile of the service block, because now you have to add additional layover time, and maybe you can't overlay it with the same 10-minute layover you may have assigned that bus to charge. So this is kind of a leap of faith situation right now. But I think this is something that we're all going to have to learn and understand, that there are going to be some operational changes that will have to be made. And I think there's a lot of stakeholders on the outside that don't understand that. I say this because I have stakeholders writing me all the time. Oh, it's a bus, plug it in, it's on the road. Well, if the bus only lasts 8 hours and I need that bus out for 16, now I got to go hire another driver to run the same 16-hour block. And that's something we've seen even with these 3 electric buses that I had right now. I had to cut those blocks in half just so they met the range that the bus was giving me. So it is something we all need to have a very good understanding of and be able to deploy as soon as we have more vehicles in our fleet, because we need to show the data to say, all right, if we're going to make this transition, there are opportunity costs that come not only from the capital side of the equation, but the operational side as well. But I would definitely be interested in talking with you more one-on-one and with others at the T about it, because it's critical for us, especially up here in the Northeast. I've talked to Buffalo and others in the Northeast as well, and we all are in the same boat. So
that's super helpful. And could I ask I have 2 other questions sort of in a
Sure.
similar vein? So one is, how do you set your layovers? On our end, we set layovers because we want to make sure that the 90th percentile runtime, that we aren't departing late for the next trip. So we don't always have 10 minutes available at the end of each trip today. Some days it's 10 minutes, some days it's 0 minutes.
I can commiserate with that. I have that experience all the time too.
So if you actually need that time to charge, are you increasing the amount of time that you've allocated to layover? And do you have like a rule of thumb for how you figure that out?
So when we decided we were going to make the electrification effort to the R line, we had a higher level of confidence in the layover situation just because we could shift all the layover to the charging facility, just given the route profile. But we recognize, and we've conveyed this to other stakeholders, that the R line is a very unique case. We have a lot more control over that route because of the number of vehicles assigned to it, the length of the route, and the fact that it already has a number of other treatments. That route includes transit priority elements to help make it more efficient operationally speaking, so we can claw back some time just generally from the corridor. But we have some routes that travel all the way from Providence to Newport. And like you said, I may schedule, 15 minutes of layover at the Gateway Center in Newport, but find out, oh, I only have 2. Well, I guess either we're not going to run that service or I need to get another bus. And so that adds a new level of operational complexity. And so that is something we're going to be looking at as we do our transition plan, is to really map out what do we need to do in terms of layover and charging cycle as it pertains to extended blocks, especially with the transit master plan, because it does call for a lot more frequency and a lot longer span of service. So that obviously is going to change the profile of every route that we have in the whole state. So that is something we're definitely going to be exploring and building into our infrastructure requirements as well. I apologize if it doesn't answer your question, Tali, but I'm happy to expand further by email on that with you and talk with the service planning folks more.
Okay, for sure. And then just one last one, and then I'll give some other folks a chance. But how did you arrive at the decision on the whole depot charging versus, topping up at the terminals? And how many chargers do you have in the terminals, and how many buses do you usually have laying over at once and charging? And can you talk about that?
No, I can speak to that. So it didn't take very long for us to realize that depot charging only wasn't going to be an option. And that was because when we were doing our initial run before we selected the R line to be the primary route for these 3 electric buses for the pilot, we would send them on blocks that would go 140, 170, even upwards of 200 miles in a day. And I would be getting alerts saying the bus has 20% power, and that bus would have been fully charged and only lasted maybe about 8 hours. And so I'm like, well, some of these routes go for 16 hours. I can't bring a bus back and then put another one on the road because, as you know from the service planning world, that's an operational inefficiency, because now I have to go get another person on the road to replace that vehicle. And then you're adding deadhead time to bring the other vehicle back. So that was one thing. And then the other part was when we were in the winter, I think it was the second winter I was here, which would have been the first winter with the electric buses on the road. We had a day where the temperature was almost 0. And we had the electric bus out. It left at, 6 in the morning. And by 10 a.m., I had gotten an alert saying, your bus now is at 50% charge. And so I'm like, okay, that's a problem. It's only been out for a few hours. It has only half of its battery. It needs to be on the road till at least 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This does not bode well. By noon, the alert came back saying it's below 25%. And I'm like, well, okay, we can't do depot charge only in the winter. Otherwise, we're going to have a fleet that can't operate for 3 months a year. And that's just not acceptable from a capital perspective. So we said, okay, if we have to spend more money to get an on-route charger, we'll do that if it means we have a more higher confidence interval with the electric bus. To determine the actual level of infrastructure required, we brought on a consultant who we worked with for many years on electrification just in general, who did modeling of our service blocks, not just as they were today, but also over the long term with our master plan. Said, okay, based on the fact that you have 3 vehicles generally at layover at the southern end of the route, based on the blocks you provided to us, we feel confident that you can put in enough on-route chargers so that you have enough for all 3 there, depending on their state of charge, and still have 1 or 2 available in case either one goes down, or if you end up finding out that instead of having 3 vehicles at layover, you end up having 4, in which case then you're not having a bus wait and have an extended layover. But that's part of our ongoing process as we do our long-term process, is saying, how many can we actually have in layover at any one point and how do we model it in such a way that we have a 90% confidence interval that we're not going to have a massive bunch up at the end of the route. The R line, again, is a unique route. Most of our routes don't have 12 vehicles on them. Some have 8, many have just 2, in which case those with 2 vehicles, it just becomes, all right, is it 2 vehicles or is it ending up being 3 vehicles to operate that service? And what is the infrastructure requirement for that? But even though we are using on-route chargers, we still have procured and will be installing a few depot chargers here at the Elmwood garage, just in case a vehicle, let's say at the end of service at night, I have a couple of buses that run until about 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. Let's say they come back with 50% and I need that vehicle on the road at 7 a.m. Well, I can still charge that bus overnight. I'm outside the peak demand charge period for charging. I can just plug that bus in with one of the depot chargers and top it up enough so that when it goes on the road, it can at least run enough of a trip. So by the time it reaches its on-route charging event, it's not so low on power that we're burning through all the power on that particular vehicle. Now, again, that's the R line specifically. That may not pan out for everything I want to do. I can tell you, once we talk about some of our much more regional routes that run from Providence to the southern part of the state, that's a whole different ballgame. So I'm more than happy, Melissa, to set up time to talk with you and others about this and more, because most of the stakeholders on the outside don't necessarily understand this. And it's a very complex and very hard thing to discuss. So yeah, I'll shoot an email after this.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, I am learning a lot, I will say. Anybody else, any questions? I'm particularly interested in hearing from anybody who is kind of just starting out on planning for fleet transitions and electrification, and might be learning something from all of this all of this content that Zach is giving us.
I don't buy it. No?
No more questions? Nothing at all?
I must have frightened all of them.
Well, it is a lot of information and it's a lot to absorb. And, of course, Zach has indicated his openness to saying more and communicating by email. Melissa, looks like you have more questions.
Yeah, well, I wanted to give other folks a chance, but I spotted an opportunity. So I was wondering, I've been trying to figure out, how long does it take to top off the buses at the, what do you call it when it's at the stations, at the terminals? So not
you're talking about the on-route chargers I have?
Yeah. So like, is it an extra 5 or 10 minutes, or do people ever get fancy and like have an extra bus in the mix so that there's, one charging and you can swap your bus? Or are you planning to continue having like an operator stays with their bus for their entire block? So
in the ideal situation for our plan, we're hoping that let's say the layover is 10 minutes. My hope is that, and based on all the research I've read about the chargers we're ordering, and from all the peers I've talked to, they've said generally the on-route charger is between 7 to 9 minutes. And that's assuming that the battery is nearly dead. Now, one thing we did make an operational decision on is, instead of buying a bus with a very large battery, so 440 kilowatts, I'm buying a bus with a 215 kilowatt hour battery. So well than 50% less than most electric buses. The argument for that is that the bus will either charge every time it returns to the terminal or every other trip, because the modeling we have done shows that we can spread out the vehicles enough so that we don't have 5 at one end and 6 at the other end. Now, that also does mean that we have to have a level of confidence that this charger says it's going to be done within that 7 to 9 minute period. And maybe there is an instance where there's enough of a gap where, all right, the bus has 70 or 80% charge, we can still send that bus and they can come back and recharge. And if that means we have to charge it a little bit more often than not, then that's important data for us to know as we're planning out the long term, which is why the R line is kind of the good use case here, because it is the most frequent and it's the busiest, it has the most vehicles. And if we're going to go statewide, that means, all right, charging a bus that does a 16-mile round trip is a very different than a bus that does 45 or 50 miles round trip on a regional route between Providence and Newport. So it's important for us to get a sense of, if we can't make electrification work for this one short route in the urban core, doing it statewide is going to be a whole different ballgame and not an easy one to implement. So that's why this adoption is critical for us to have a very good understanding of the long term.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question, and I see Mark Older put something in the chat. Do you have any information on how much of cold and hot weather penalty is due to controlling temperature on the bus and how much is due to reduced battery efficiency?
So I can tell you that because I have the real-time vehicle monitoring software that I was telling Melissa earlier, I have a running database of all of the energy consumption levels. I have all the data from the state of charge from the beginning of service to end of service. I have the ability to tie that to the weather trends throughout the day. And, you know, I can tell you, if you were to look at this data, and I can't share all of it right now because we haven't finished the pilot and we haven't finished our transition plan, which is important for us to have all this data ready, is that on days where the temperature is definitely below 40 degrees, I can tell you my state of charge goes down much faster. And I can tell you that reflects on the number of miles I've done. Like, there's a day where probably last winter, we had a day where the temperature was in the teens, and the bus left with 100% charge. Because it was running on the R line at that point, it meant that at least it wasn't doing, you know, 100 or 200 miles in a day, or attempting to do that anyways. But we would have the bus stop, pretty much every bus stop along the R line, which is rather frequent as opposed to a regional route, let alone a more distant suburban route that we have in the state. And we would see that the energy levels would increase every time the door opens, which means all the energy to heat the bus would go out of the bus. You close the door. Now I have to consume more power to bring the heating back up to where it was before the door opened. But by the time it got there, the door opened again. So we could definitely tell, and that is something that we're definitely keeping an eye on as we're doing our transition effort, is saying, all right, what is the worst case scenario, and how does that relate to the infrastructure requirement as well? I don't think the battery efficiency is the issue, although I will say that battery technology is constantly evolving. Just because I have a battery that's on a Proterra today, it's not going to be the same battery that I have with these new Flyers, and it's not going to be the same battery that's available 4 years from now. I suspect the technology will continue to improve, but like every operator, we're all going to keep a close eye on how this evolves, you know, and how that relates to our long-term vision as well. I also see Tim's question. Most of the recharging right now, at least with the depot chargers that we have for the Proterras, those recharging activities are being done by the utility staff because they're the ones who are obligated under union contracts to be responsible for it. But, you know, given that we're going to transition ultimately over to an on-route charger solution, there is going to be some training involved to help the drivers align themselves correctly to the pantograph, have them understand how to better gauge their electricity usage on the road. And then just kind of explaining them the process. Because unlike a diesel bus, you just say, go out and drive. Electric bus, they have to be far more attentive to their operating environment than with a diesel bus generally.
All right. Well, I think at this point, given that it is 4:59, I'm going to refer future questions to Zach by email. But I have a couple of announcements to make. If we could go to the next couple slides, Stella. So we do have more of these coffee chats coming up. We have one on human services transportation, which is going to be on March 10th, also at 4 p.m. I'm going to put the link to the registration for that in the chat. And then you are the first people hearing about this, but we have a newly scheduled coffee chat on confronting driver shortages. We had a very successful, interesting coffee chat on that back in November. And we have successfully recruited the new FTA-supported Transit Workforce Center to come talk with us about it. So that's going to be on Wednesday, April 6th at 4 p.m. And I also just put the registration form for that in the chat. And then there are more upcoming that I will hopefully be announcing soon. So if we can go to the next slide. And then, so You all know me, I think, but I'm just going to put my email in the chat here as well. And I really appreciate everyone turning out, especially Zach being our guest speaker. This has been super interesting. I hope it will be an ongoing conversation. I could see us doing this again on the same topic, and certainly we'll check in with you, Zach, and maybe have you back at some point to hear how things are going. So at that point, feel free to reach out to me, to Stella, or to Zach if you have any questions. And we will also be posting the recording of this meeting to YouTube, and you'll be able to access it there. I know I got some questions from folks who had registered but weren't able to make it at the last moment about that. So if you have any colleagues who'd like to hear what we're up to, we can forward that to them as well.
And to Kaylin, yes, Sandy has my slide deck. He can share it with those as well. So
I will be posting the slide deck to the MPO meeting calendar, and I'll send out an email after the meeting to folks who registered or to the whole transit working group list. All right. With that, have a great night, everybody.